The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the sterile courthouse hallway, casting harsh shadows on Marcus Thompson's weathered face as he sat alone on the wooden bench, his janitor's uniform still bearing the faint scent of industrial cleaner. His calloused hands trembled slightly as he clutched a manila folder containing documents that could change everything, while around him, lawyers in expensive suits hurried past without a second glance at the man who would become the unlikely center of a custody battle that would shake the foundations of everything everyone thought they knew about family, love, and what it truly means to be a father. 6 months earlier, Marcus had been nothing more than a ghost moving through the pristine corridors of Hamilton Industries, pushing his cart of cleaning supplies past executives who looked through him as if he were invisible. At 42, his life had been reduced to a routine of mopping floors, emptying trash bins, and returning each night to his cramped studio apartment where photographs of his deceased wife Sarah lined the windowsill like silent witnesses to dreams that had died 3 years ago in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and broken promises. Sarah had been his everything, his high school sweetheart who had believed in his potential even when he couldn't see it himself. And when the cancer took her, it had taken his faith in tomorrow along with her. The night everything changed started like any other, with Marcus working the late shift on the 15th floor of the Hamilton building, where CEO Victoria Hamilton's corner office commanded a view of the city that stretched beyond the horizon. He had always found a strange peace in the silence of empty offices, where the weight of other people's expectations couldn't reach him, where he could exist without judgment or pity. But as he approached the executive suite that Tuesday evening, he heard something that made his blood run cold. The sound of a child crying, not the frustrated tears of a tantrum, but the desperate, terrified sobs of someone in real danger. Marcus dropped his mop and followed the sound to Victoria Hamilton's office, where, through the partially open door, he saw 8-year-old Emma Hamilton backed into a corner, while her stepfather, Richard Blackwood, Victoria's new husband of 6 months, loomed over her with a fury that turned Marcus's stomach. The man's face was twisted with rage as he grabbed the child's small arm, his voice a vicious whisper that carried clearly in the silence. "I told you what would happen if you told your mother about our little brat. Maybe it's time I taught you what happens to children who don't listen." Without thinking, without considering the consequences or his job or anything beyond the terror in that little girl's eyes, Marcus burst through the door. "Get away from her," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Richard spun around, his face immediately shifting to a mask of indignant surprise, but Marcus had seen enough abuse in his own childhood to recognize the signs, the calculated way predators operated when they thought no one was watching. "Excuse me," Richard said, straightening his tie with practiced calm, "but I think there's been a misunderstanding here. This is a private family matter, and I suggest you return to your cleaning duties." But Emma had already run to Marcus, her small hands clutching at his uniform as she buried her face against his leg, her whole body shaking with relief at finding someone who would stand between her and the monster who had been terrorizing her behind closed doors. In that moment, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death: purpose, the absolute certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. "I'm calling security." Richard threatened, reaching for his phone, but Marcus was already lifting Emma into his arms, feeling the way she clung to him with desperate trust, and he knew that whatever happened next, he couldn't let this child go back into the hands of someone who would hurt her. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because this story is about to take a turn that will challenge everything you believe about what makes a family. The security footage from that night would later become crucial evidence, showing Richard's aggressive behavior and Emma's obvious fear. But in the immediate aftermath, Marcus found himself suspended from his job pending an investigation into his inappropriate interference in what Hamilton Industries initially tried to frame as a misunderstanding between a stepfather and his child. Victoria Hamilton, who had been traveling on business during the incident, returned to find her world turned upside down, her new marriage under scrutiny, and her daughter refusing to speak to anyone except the janitor who had saved her. Marcus spent the next several days in limbo, knowing that his actions had likely cost him his job, but unable to regret them when he thought about Emma's tears and the way she had run to him for protection. He survived on his meager savings, while lawyers he couldn't afford began calling him, some representing Victoria Hamilton and her interests, others claiming to represent Emma's welfare, all of them speaking in legal jargon that made his head spin, while the one thing that mattered most remained unclear. Was Emma safe? The answer came in the form of an unexpected visit from Victoria Hamilton herself, who arrived at Marcus's apartment building in a black sedan that looked out of place among the rust-stained cars and broken streetlights of his neighborhood. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs to his door wearing a business suit that probably cost more than Marcus made in 6 months. But her perfectly composed exterior cracked the moment she saw him, revealing a mother's desperation beneath the CEO's polished facade. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to know exactly what you saw that night, because my daughter hasn't spoken a single word since I brought her home from the hospital. The doctors say there's nothing physically wrong with her, but she won't talk to anyone, except she keeps asking for the man who helped her, and when I show her your picture, she nods." Marcus invited her inside his modest apartment, acutely aware of the contrast between her world and his, but Victoria seemed oblivious to her surroundings as she sank into his second-hand couch and finally allowed herself to break down. "I trusted him," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Richard was charming, successful, everything I thought Emma needed in a father figure after her biological father abandoned us when she was 2. I was so busy building my company, so focused on providing for her future, that I missed the signs that she was being hurt in my own home." As Marcus listened to Victoria's story, he began to understand the complex web of guilt and responsibility that had brought them to this moment. Victoria had built Hamilton Industries from nothing, driven by the same protective instinct that now consumed her. But success had come at the cost of time with her daughter, creating the very vacuum that Richard had exploited. She had married him thinking she was giving Emma stability and security, never imagining that she was inviting a predator into their lives. "The police are investigating, but Richard has connections, expensive lawyers, and he's claiming that you assaulted him, that you're some kind of unstable person with a history of inappropriate behavior toward children. His attorneys are painting you as the real threat, and without Emma's testimony, it's going to be your word against his." Marcus felt the familiar weight of being judged by his circumstances, of being dismissed because he cleaned toilets instead of boardrooms, because he lived in a neighborhood where gunshots were more common than garden parties, because he was just another working-class man that society had written off as irrelevant. But then he thought about Emma's trust, the way she had instinctively known he would protect her, and he realized that for the first time since Sarah's death, someone needed him, not just to exist, but to fight. "What do you need me to do?" he asked simply, and Victoria looked up at him with something that might have been hope beginning to kindle in her eyes. What followed were weeks of legal preparation that turned Marcus's quiet life upside down. Victoria had hired the best family law attorney money could buy, but even she warned them that the case would be difficult without Emma's testimony, especially given Richard's resources and reputation in the community. Marcus found himself subjected to background checks, psychological evaluations, and depositions where opposing lawyers tried to paint him as everything from a failed father figure to a potential predator himself. The hardest moment came when they allowed Marcus to visit Emma in the supervised setting of the child psychologist's office, hoping that his presence might encourage her to speak about what had happened. She ran to him immediately, wrapping her small arms around his neck and whispering so quietly that only he could hear. "He said he would hurt you too if I told anyone. He said nobody would believe me because you're just the cleaner and he's important." Marcus held her close, feeling the weight of her trust and the magnitude of what they were up against, and he whispered back, "Sometimes the most important people are the ones who take care of others when nobody's watching. And I promise you, Emma, I'm not going anywhere." But Richard's lawyers were relentless, and as the custody hearing approached, they had successfully painted a picture of Marcus as an unstable man who had overstepped his bounds and potentially traumatized a child with his interference. They argued that Emma's silence was actually a result of his inappropriate involvement, not evidence of Richard's abuse, and that Victoria's decision to trust a janitor over her husband showed poor judgment that called her fitness as a mother into question. The courtroom on the day of the hearing was packed with reporters, child advocates, and social workers, all drawn to a case that had captured public attention as a battle between corporate power and working-class decency. Richard sat with his legal team looking confident and composed, while Marcus felt increasingly small and out of place in his only suit, a hand-me-down from his brother that didn't quite fit properly. Judge Patricia Morrison called the court to order. And for the next 4 hours, Marcus watched lawyers present competing versions of reality, each side wielding evidence and testimony like weapons in a war where Emma's future hung in the balance. Richard's team painted him as a devoted stepfather who had been trying to discipline a troubled child when he was assaulted by an unstable janitor with delusions of heroism. They presented character witnesses who testified to Richard's standing in the community, his charitable work, his apparent devotion to his new family. Victoria's attorney countered with the security footage, expert testimony about child abuse patterns, and Marcus's own account of what he had witnessed. But even as he testified, he could feel the skepticism in the room, the assumption that his word carried less weight because of who he was and where he came from. The opposing counsel's cross-examination was brutal, focusing on his financial struggles, his depression after his wife's death, his lack of children of his own, painting him as a man whose judgment couldn't be trusted. But the most devastating moment came when Richard himself took the stand, presenting himself as a grieving stepfather whose attempts to bond with his new daughter had been criminally misinterpreted by a disturbed employee. He spoke with smooth confidence about his love for Emma, his concern for her well-being, his shock at being accused of abuse by a man who barely knew them. "Your Honor," Richard said, his voice thick with apparent emotion, "I understand that Mr. Thompson may have genuinely believed he was helping Emma, but his interference has traumatized my stepdaughter to the point where she can no longer speak. I fear that his unstable mental state and his projection of his own losses onto our family situation has created a tragedy where none existed before." As Richard's testimony concluded, Marcus felt the case slipping away. Felt the familiar crushing weight of a system that favored the wealthy and well-connected over the vulnerable and powerless. Victoria squeezed his hand under the table, but her expression was grim, and even her expensive attorney looked concerned about the direction the hearing was taking. Judge Morrison called for a recess, and as the courtroom began to empty, Marcus noticed Emma sitting in the back row with her court-appointed advocate, her small figure almost lost among the adults who were deciding her fate. She had been silent throughout the entire proceeding, but now she was staring directly at him, and in her eyes he saw not just trust, but a kind of desperate courage that reminded him of Sarah in her final days, when she had fought against impossible odds, not for herself, but for the people she loved. When court reconvened, Judge Morrison addressed the room with the gravity befitting a decision that would determine not just custody arrangements, but whether justice could exist in a world where power and privilege so often overwhelmed truth and vulnerability. "Before I render my decision," she said, "I want to give Emma Hamilton one final opportunity to speak. Not because the court requires her testimony, but because every child deserves to have their voice heard in matters that affect their future." The courtroom fell silent as Emma stood up in the back row, her small hand still clasped in her advocate's, and began walking slowly toward the front of the room. Every step seemed to echo in the hushed space as she approached the witness stand, passing Richard's table without looking at him, her eyes fixed steadily on Marcus as if drawing strength from his presence. Share if you've ever experienced something similar, because what happened next would change not just Emma's life, but the lives of everyone in that courtroom who witnessed the power of a child's courage in the face of those who had tried to silence her. When Emma finally reached the witness stand, Judge Morrison knelt down to her level, her voice gentle but clear. "Emma, sweetie, you don't have to say anything if you don't want to, but if there's something you'd like to tell us, we're all here to listen." For a long moment, Emma said nothing, her small fingers twisted together as she looked around the courtroom at all the faces staring back at her. Then she turned to Marcus, and in a voice that was small but absolutely clear, she said, "He's not my daddy. My daddy left when I was little, and Richard isn't my daddy either, because daddies don't hurt their children or make them scared to go to sleep at night." The courtroom remained absolutely silent as Emma continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "But Marcus is like a daddy, because when I was scared and Richard was being mean to me, Marcus came, and he wasn't afraid of Richard, even though Richard is big and important. And Marcus held me when I was crying, and he didn't ask for anything back. He just wanted me to be safe." She paused, wiping her nose with the back of her hand, and then she said the words that would echo in that courtroom long after the gavel fell. "Richard told me that nobody would care about what happened to me because I'm just a little kid and he's a grown-up who knows important people. But Marcus cared about me, even though he didn't know me, even though I'm not his real daughter." He said that real families are made when people choose to take care of each other. And that's what he did for me. He chose to be my protector when I needed one most. Emma's voice broke slightly as she concluded, I want to live with my mommy, but I want Marcus to be part of our family too, because he's the only person who ever put himself in danger just to keep me safe. He's the daddy I always wished I could have, the kind who would fight monsters instead of being one. The silence that followed Emma's words was profound and complete, broken only by the sound of Richard's chair scraping against the floor as he stood abruptly and walked out of the courtroom, his legal team scrambling to follow him. Judge Morrison's eyes were bright with tears as she looked from Emma to Marcus to Victoria, seeing not just a custody case, but a testament to the bonds that form between souls who recognize each other across the artificial barriers of class and circumstance. Emma, Judge Morrison said softly, thank you for being so brave and telling us the truth. Your words today have helped us understand something very important about what makes a real family. The judge's final ruling was swift and decisive. Richard would face criminal charges for child abuse, his parental rights would be terminated, and Emma would remain in her mother's custody with regular visitation from Marcus, who would be formally recognized as her chosen guardian and father figure. But beyond the legal language and official documents, something much more profound had occurred in that courtroom. A recognition that family is not defined by biology or marriage certificates, but by the courage to love and protect those who need us most. As they left the courthouse that day, Victoria approached Marcus with tears streaming down her face and an offer that would change his life. A position as head of security at Hamilton Industries, with a salary that would allow him to move out of his studio apartment and into a home where Emma could visit regularly, where he could continue to be the father figure she had chosen for herself. I can't give you back your wife, Victoria said, but I can give you the chance to be the father that Emma needs. And maybe in helping her heal, you'll find a way to heal too. Marcus looked down at Emma, who was holding his hand with the absolute trust of a child who had found her safe harbor in the most unlikely place. And he realized that Sarah would have loved this moment, would have been proud to see him using his pain to protect someone else's child from experiencing the kind of loss that had nearly destroyed him. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the backyard of his new house watching Emma play on the swing set that he had built for her, her laughter carrying on the evening breeze like music that had been missing from his life for too long. Victoria joined him on the porch, and together they watched the child who had brought them together create new memories that would overwrite the trauma of her past. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been working late that night? Victoria asked, and Marcus considered the question, thinking about the random chance that had put him in the right place at the right time to hear Emma's cries for help. I think, he said finally, that sometimes people find each other exactly when they're supposed to, not because of fate or destiny, but because there are moments when the choice to act with courage creates the family we never knew we needed. But because as Emma called out to him from the swing set, asking him to push her higher toward the clouds, Marcus realized that the greatest victories in life aren't measured by wealth or status, but by the moments when we choose to stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. when we choose to see the humanity in others regardless of their circumstances, and when we choose to build families not from blood or law, but from love and the simple recognition that we all deserve someone who will fight for us when the world seems determined to tear us down. The story of Marcus Thompson and Emma Hamilton became more than just a custody case or a news story. It became a reminder that heroes don't always wear capes or hold positions of power. Sometimes they wear janitor's uniforms and push mops through empty hallways, waiting for the moment when their ordinary lives intersect with extraordinary need. When their choice to act with compassion rather than indifference creates ripples that extend far beyond anything they could have imagined, proving that the most important families are those we choose to build with love, courage, and the unwavering belief that every child deserves someone who will move heaven and earth to keep them safe.